So in this very short video, we are going to meet some modern pioneers, going to know psychologist-historians, Professor Alexandra Rutherford and Professor Wade Pickren. They are the authors of the textbook that we will be using in our class. Okay, so let's do this. It's going to be hopefully a quick getting to know you. So let's begin with this one. Maybe you can kindly introduce yourselves to our students. What are your research interests and professional background? How do you become psychologist historians? And what do you think was compelling about the field of history that led you to contribute to it?
Great.
You first.
Shall I get started? Okay. So I'm Alexandra Rutherford, and I'm at York University in Toronto. I teach and supervise graduate students and undergraduate students in the historical, theoretical, and critical studies of psychology graduate program. So that's where I am. My area of research is the history of gender and feminist psychology, mostly focused on the work of feminist psychologists after sort of in the late 20th century and their efforts to change ideas about gender and about policy that's related to women's experiences. So that's kind of where my center of gravity is in terms of research these days. And finally, how did I become a psychologist historian? I got really interested in history during my graduate training. So I started off as a clinical psychologist or doing clinical psychology graduate training. And as I was learning about how to do research in psychology in a more specialized way, I became a bit disillusioned with the kind of epistemologies and methods of sort of mainstream psychology, what I would now call, looking back on it, that I didn't have the language then, of hegemonic psychology. So I got a little bit, shall we say, I started to question the ways that psychologists went about gathering knowledge, especially the tradition of doing experimental laboratory-based research, because it seemed to me that it wasn't very, in many ways, it wasn't generating meaningful knowledge about being human because of the way it was being done. And it wasn't allowing participants to have agency and to, relate in really meaningful ways. So I was having the experience of doing that kind of research, and that was starting to turn me off. And so I looked to history as a way of studying psychology and a way of making greater meaning out of in an effort to understand the human experience. So that's my story.
I'm Wade. So here's how it happened for me. I went to grad school when I was older. And so I initially did a clinical health psychology master's, and because I was very interested in issues of health. I was pretty disappointed in the program. I went to the University of Florida, although I think that's a beautiful campus and I'd grown up loving it. Their clinical program at the time, I'm not sure how it is now, it just was too reductionistic. It didn't really account for the fullness of human life at all. But I went ahead and earned my master's. It's been a year getting some kind of advanced training in anxiety disorders, but then just decided, okay, that's all I want to do with this area. And I actually switched over to the other department of psychology at the University of Florida, which was just a regular arts and sciences department. And did a PhD, did my work, again, still focused on health, but really how psychologists and psychiatrists interacted over a number of years to kind of delineate or articulate issues of human health, like what used to be called psychosomatic disorders and sexual disorders and that sort of thing. So it was a historical, kind of theoretical dissertation, way too long, to be honest. And then whenever I finished grad school, I also took a lot of history of science courses at the University of Florida. And so when I finished, I stayed on and taught a bit, and then was hired by the American Psychological Association to be their first historian and director of archives, and stayed there 8 years. During that time, I met Alexandra, and we were became an item, as they say, or a couple. But at that time, I mean, I was still doing stuff related to, and I still do. I still like to write about psychology and health. Not very much, but I still do it some. But I went to work for APA, and one of the things I saw right away when I started with them, in terms of historically, is that in the US, we simply we had never bothered in the field of psychology and or history of psychology to really pay any attention to what African-American psychologists had contributed to the field. They had remained kind of out of focus. And I met some African-American psychologists who were senior people who had made amazing contributions. And I started working with them, and we did a big project called Elder Voices, which documented the history of African-American psychologists' contributions to the field of psychology, both in terms of scholarship and in terms of practice. For example, I'll just give one quick example. I'm sure you've heard of positive psychology. And really what positive psychology is, it became popular in the late 1990s and now continuing till this day. The folks who started it, I'm sure, are good human beings. I know almost all of them. But they really ignored the contributions of Black psychologists to positive psychology. It was really Black psychologists who started the first positive psychology by building, as they would argue, on community strengths. So it wasn't just the individual, but it was the community they were part of. And that was a wonderful project. And in some ways, I'm still involved in that. And we're still doing that. I think it's ongoing. It's beautiful. Now, many other people have taken it up. So I'm very happy about that. And it really was other people's contributions. I just happened to be the person who was facilitating, the documenting of it. But it was their contributions, not mine. And in that time, that really began to raise questions about cultural factors as well, in terms of how we understand ourselves and how a field like psychology is developed. And this is where I first came across, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Sequoia Filipino, and Alfred Legmai and Virgilio Enriquez. And so this was early, maybe 2001, 2, I first came across this, and was just absolutely fascinated by it. I think we were the first, that I know of, the first textbook that really focused on, how psychology should not just be thought of as just a North American or a Western product, but how it's been taken up in different places of the world. The whole tension between developing an indigenous psychology and also trying to, if you will, have some correspondence there with other psychologies. Anyway, wonderful work. And so this is really, it was these areas of both kind of race and culture that pulled me deeper and deeper into history of psychology, kind of like Alexandra said. It's really, I think, one of the best ways to understand what has happened and is happening, not just in the past, but currently in the field of psychology. And
one of the messages of a history class is that there's more or less some unity that you may have discovered. Yeah. So I guess my next question would be, can you share with us some of the things that you discovered about psychology or even about the human experience that you feel seem to bind or feel together, if that's even possible?
Very good question.
Yeah. That's a good question, Tone. And I don't know that I have a very good answer for that. I guess, and there's, as you may well know, there's a bit of a debate even within the community of people who do history and theory of psychology about whether psychology should be really considered a unified entity, area of study at all, right? So that it's just so made up of so many different branches, obviously, but also more interesting to me is so many different fundamental ways of seeing the world and ways of gathering knowledge that it becomes difficult in some ways to say, okay, these are the things that are just absolutely in common everywhere. And if there's anything that as a psychologist historian I kind of fall back on, is that for me the constant is the importance of context and the importance of specificity and locality, and the ways that gender and culture and all lots of other contextual variables and social locations contribute to the knowledge base and study of human behavior. And I feel like that kind of, for me, it's the localized knowledge that is interesting in terms of how that develops. Okay. And I leave it to the cultural and cross-cultural psychologists to figure out how to fit it all together into a bigger theory. But my interest as a historian has always been to understand whether it's gender, or if it's this understanding the psychology of gender, or this how that develops in tandem with the history, politics, economics, and culture of a particular place. And in fact, in about 10 years ago now, I worked with some co-authors, co-editors in India, in the UK, and in, gosh, where was it? In South Africa, yes. South Africa, India, and the UK. And we tried to put together an edited volume that looked at the ways in which, in fact, feminism and psychology had developed in different parts of the world, and whether they had an influence on each other in those parts of the world. And if so, what did that kind of create in terms of a psychology of women? And we had contributors from about 15 or 16 different, mostly countries, in one case a region, and they tried to trace the history of that. And so that was our attempt at kind of doing a history of indigenous feminist psychology, if you will. And for me, that's what's really interesting. And there were commonalities. One of the commonalities was the influence of colonialism on the development of both feminism and psychology and their intersections. So that was kind of interesting. So anyway, that's my kind of take on your question, and I'll pass it along to Wade.
Yeah. So I'm really more of a champion of the local, to be honest. I don't know that one could ever prove or disprove whether there are kind of superordinate commonalities that somehow or another are just that are across everywhere and all times, all places. Since I think that everything is contextual and contingent as well. And I'm not going to argue whether there are commonalities or not, or things that bind us together. It's just that we are all shaped by the context that we grow up in, the local, our families, the local societies, so forth and so on.
So I guess without giving too much away, what can students expect to learn in a history of psychology course?
When I teach history of psychology, I want my students to learn, I want them to learn about some of the major ideas and some of the important people and so on. That's all interesting, I think, and that's what you kind of hang your story on. But moreover, I want my students to learn a way of thinking about understanding psychology and its place in the world, right? And this is a story of psychology as a psychology gaining authority, gaining scientific authority, gaining cultural authority, and wielding that authority in certain ways. And I want my students to become humble about that as they train to be psychologists, right? Because psychologists have gained a lot of authority. Psychology as a discipline has gained authority, and it's imposed that authority in many parts of the world in different ways. And I want them to understand how that happens. So I want them to understand the politics of knowledge. I want them to understand that we as psychologists have a responsibility to make knowledge that is not damaging, and moreover is potentially emancipatory, right? And the history of both of those things, right, has happened. We look at the history of eugenics and intelligence testing as one of the ways that psychology has not been emancipatory, that it's been very oppressive, right? So knowing that history, how can we evaluate the things that psychologists do now so that we don't make that kind of knowledge and we don't use it in those ways? So I want my students to really gain an appreciation of that. And I think that critical history is a really good way of teaching that. So
For this final question for our students, sort of like words of encouragement, if you may, as we move to another semester of this online virtual mode. I guess, what can you share with our students on how they can possibly maximize a course such as the history of psychology?
want to take this one?
Well, because you're currently still teaching it, so no longer teaching it. So.
I love teaching history of psychology. And I think, so words of encouragement, use it as an opportunity to really see psychology in a different way, right? Because as psychology students, right, we're often embroiled in learning the content, right, of the discipline, and what's the most cutting edge research in this kind of psychology or that kind of psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, and we never get a chance to we rarely get a chance to stand back and say, okay, this thing called psychology, how does it actually function in the world, right? What does it actually mean to be a psychologist? What does that meant 100 years ago, 50 years ago? What does it mean now? And this course is an opportunity to do that, right? Not only, and then also to critically evaluate the things that you're learning in other courses, and to say, oh, where, we're talking about all of this stuff in another area of psychology and another course I'm taking. But where does that actually come from? And who does it represent? And what was the history of that? And how can that make us more critical? And by critical, I don't mean criticize. I just mean asking these kinds of questions, right, about this knowledge. Where does it come from? Who does it serve? Who does it not serve? Those kinds of questions. This course is an opportunity, right, to acquire the skills to be able to ask those questions of the things that you're learning in psychology, but also in other courses. And I think this is the wonderful thing about this course, and that I would encourage students to let themselves kind of relax into that a little bit, because it may be one of the only opportunities that they have to do it. And I think coming out of your education with those skills, whether you go into psychology or not, is really important, but especially in psychology, I think. So those would be my words of encouragement, and enjoy it, and enjoy some of the interesting stories, right, that you encounter. Because in some ways, history is very much a narrative, right? Yeah. And a good story is enjoyable, and it should be engaging and engrossing. So do both of those things, I would say.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that I would say to not do is not to worry so much about dates.
Yes.
Sometimes, so often I would teach the class and students would come up to me after the first class and say, I'm terrible with dates. I'm going to fail this class. I said, don't worry. You don't have to be concerned about dates. It's not, like it happened in 1842 or something. It's really trying to get the sense of things. And as Alexandra said, it's a narrative. Enjoy the story. You're a part of that story now. You're in a psychology class. You're in a history of psychology class. So you're part of the great story too. So enjoy it.
Thank you so much. Those are wonderful, wonderful words. And I hope that everyone who gets to watch this video sort of gets a preview of what's in store, and also get to be excited about learning about the story of this field. So thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful conversation.